This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming in tonight and being with us as we join Judith Sumner, and she's going to talk about the botanical history of the Civil War. She has a brand new book out on this subject, and the library actually has it on order. It hasn't arrived yet, so check back with us. I'll put it in my January newsletter, so you can it'll kind of be a reminder. Which reminds me, if you aren't getting our LTPL Grows Gardening newsletter every month, you can go to our ltpl.org website and click on subscribe to newsletters, and then you can find the LTPL Grows and click on that, and you will start getting it in your inbox almost always the first day of the month. And we talk about upcoming programs and a to-do list for whatever month it is. We've got our herb of the month. So there's a lot of goodies in that. And then, of course, new books that have just come out, we highlight. So go ahead and sign up for that. We'd love to have you join us. So after that, okay, Judith Sumner, she did a program for us last, I think, June on pickles and pickling and the lore and history of that. And so it was such an engaging program. We wanted to have her back, and since she was just this book had just come out, we thought this would be an excellent topic. And we have a lot of our gardeners also like history, so we thought it was a good combination. So Judith, I'd love for you to take over and introduce yourself, and tell a little bit about yourself and take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much, Pam. Hello, everybody. This is Judith Sumner. I actually live in Massachusetts in the middle of the state, and I am a botanist, and I have a particular interest in the historical uses of plants. And the books that I've written have all been focused in one way or another on useful plants, plants used at home, plants that are medicinal. And this book and my most recent book before it are both looking at military uses of plants during wartime. And I'll tell you at the end of the talk, I'll tell you a little bit about the other book, which is a botanical history of World War II. I trained originally in classical botany at the University of Massachusetts, taught at the college level for decades. And I think one of the most interesting comments I heard at one point from one of my mentors was that historians should bring botanists into the big tent of historical research and writing, because botanists often have a somewhat unique perspective on the natural products, the plant products, the food, the diet, the medicinal plants, the building materials, the textiles, the dyes, everything that people used historically to make their lives and to survive, in most cases, came from plant material. And so we can often come in and shed a little bit of light where historians appear to tread. So this is another one of these topics where I'm going to look at the Civil War as a botanist and look specifically at plant involvement in the Civil War. So we're going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint here. And this is the cover of the book that my publisher, McFarland, designed. And I think we'll be talking about every one of those plants tonight. I'll mention linen. We're over on the right there. That's asafoetida. We'll talk about that. Cotton, say quite a bit about cotton tonight over on the left. And again, the book covers a vast number of topics, certainly all the cash crops and how they were grown, the agriculture, how people lived, whether you were enslaved or whether you were a planter class and one of the owners or overseers of slaves, how people lived on plantations, what the gardens and the horticulture was like at the time, where they got their plants. Many of them actually came from Asia. People were growing plants inside their homes, learning about plants in schools, natural hedges, pensions, the whole business. And it goes right down that list. Today, though, we are going to focus on 4 areas. I tried to choose out 4 subtopics that I thought would be good to discuss, and I'll show you what those are in just a minute. Before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about the history of slavery, the history of enslavement in the US. Many people believe incorrectly that enslavement was something that only occurred in the South, and nothing could be further from the truth. The Body of Liberties, which was published in 1641, which was the legal code of my home state, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, allowed human bondage. And for the next 130 years, into the 1770s and 1780s, there were people enslaved, even here in Massachusetts. Quite a bit of the slavery centered on the trading triangle that we all learned about in high school, where rum and sugar and also molasses and slaves were part of this triangle circulating between the New World and that western coast of Africa. And so, indeed, there were people being brought from Africa to work up and down the eastern seaboard. This was shut down in the Northeast years before the Civil War. By the 1770s, 1780s, it was pretty much done. And by that point, there was an abolitionist movement in the Northeast looking down the coast at the Southerners, wondering why they were continuing with enslavement in the Southern states. The four topics that I'm going to talk to you today about are crops and slavery, and that will answer this question. Why is it that the Southerners doggedly pursued enslavement? How people lived on plantations, both the planter class of people and also the slaves. Talk a little bit about medicine, focusing on malaria and military medicine, and mentioning one interesting aspect of slave medicine. And then we'll talk about landscapes and war, which will include a brief discussion of military engineering, which was entirely plant dependent. So we'll start with Southern agriculture. And what was actually going on in the South involved agriculture on a vast scale, basically the cultivation of cash crops. The earliest of these cash crops, if you go back to the 1600s, early 1700s, was actually indigo. And then tobacco and rice and sugarcane came in, and then cotton overarched everything. Okay, cotton became known as King Cotton, and by the decade leading up to the Civil War, cotton was the primary cash crop. I'll say a few general things about comments about these cash crops. None of them was actually native to the American South. None of them was really a necessity anywhere. You certainly don't have to have a blue dye. You don't have to have tobacco. There are other grains besides rice. Sugarcane is certainly a luxury crop, and there are certainly other fibers besides cotton. All of them were grown for money, not for subsistence. All of them were crops that absolutely thrived in the southern climate of heat and high rainfall. And the limiting factors in cultivating all of these crops were the same. They all required a lot of labor because it was hundreds of acres that were being cultivated on any given plantation. They required new land periodically because the soil would literally become played out. And then finally, when it just became too exhausting or land began to run out, they required augmentation of their soil nutrients. In other words, some sort of fertilizer, which on a grand scale was a very, very expensive undertaking. So that's what these cash crops had in common. And we'll just quickly look at them. So this is indigo. It's a member of the pea and bean family. It gives a range of beautiful blue hues. It was originally from Asia, and there's also one related species from tropical South America. It was planted by the early colonists. It was the first really stable blue dye for cloth, and it was valued, but again, it wasn't really necessity. The British market was intense leading up to the Revolutionary War, and a lot of it was traded with Great Britain. And after the Revolutionary War, the British lost their interest in American indigo. And then tobacco. This is native to tropical America. It was a colonial cash crop in both the North and the South. The cultivation and the curing were very labor-intensive processes. In the 17th century, the herbals described tobacco as curing the plague, and so it was seen as a medicinal plant. That's totally false. We actually now know that it's actually quite a toxic plant. But this plant also required on a large scale, large amounts of slave labor. Rice is an Asian grass that is aquatic and has to grow in flooded fields that were known as rice paddies. Making these flooded fields involved trenching and damming, and this was work that had to be done on a large scale, and rice plantations exploited enslaved workers to get that done. And rice actually brought along with it a heightened danger of exposure to malaria, because the flooded fields were an ideal place for the Anopheles mosquitoes to breed and have their offspring. And so the more rice you grew, the more mosquitoes you grew, and the higher the likelihood of being exposed to malaria. We'll talk more about malaria later. Sugarcane is actually a wild grass that originated in Papua New Guinea and was introduced by Columbus to Haiti, where sugarcane plantations were cultivated by enslaved Africans. It was in India, where the technique of extracting the juice and then from the juice crystallizing sugar crystals, table sugar, was actually invented. The waste product was molasses, and so either the crystals or the molasses, the waste, could be used for the rum industry, and that became sort of a further extension of sugarcane cultivation. By 1850, American growers had established sugarcane plantations. There were hundreds of cultivated acres in Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. It was a perennial crop. It was harvested 4 times a year. And again, a lot of work in doing the pressing of the liquid to get it out for the boiling and the processing, and required a lot of slave labor. And then lastly, cotton. Cotton is a member of the mallow family. It's related to hibiscus. And the actual crop are fibers, hairs, that grow in and on around the seeds. So that big mass of cotton fibrous fuzz there has in it the embedded seeds. And in fact, that was one of the great challenges of cotton cultivation and processing, that the seeds were very hard to separate from the mass of fibers. And it wasn't until the first cotton gin was invented on a large scale by Eli Whitney in 1793 that this problem was overcome. Cotton, as I mentioned before, became the main cash crop in the years leading up to the Civil War in the American South. It was known as King Cotton. The cotton gin eased the tedious task of removing the seeds. As the soil played out, guano, bird dung, harvested from South American islands, became the desired and extremely expensive but highly desirable soil amendment, soil nutrient, fertilizer. And there were many factors that really drove cotton cultivation. Here you can see the fibers actually clinging to the seeds. You can see a scanning electron micrograph up at the top there. The fibers are little microscopic hairs, and they actually come in 2 sizes, long and short. The long ones are the lints and the short ones are the linters. And different breeds of cotton have different proportions of lints and linters. And there was a lot of hybridization, a lot of specific breeding for specific types of cotton that had high output, that were rot resistant, insect resistant. Quite a bit of early genetic work was in cotton fields. And here's some advertisements for guano. Guano was originally discovered by Alexander von Humboldt at the beginning of the 19th century. It had long been used by Incan farmers who realized that they needed to protect the seabirds. And you can see the seabirds there at the bottom of the page on either side of the Dixie Guano Company advertisement. These birds lived on islands off the coast of South America, and there were thousands, tens of thousands of these birds, and they deposited their dung, and the dung became several feet in depth, and it could be mined and exported. It was expensive because of the mining and the exporting. But the nutrient content of the guano could not be beat. It had high nitrogen, high potassium, and high phosphorus, similar to the NPK fertilizers that we use today. Like if you buy 10-10-10 or 15-7-7 or put on your garden, that's basically the chemical equivalent of guano. So you can see some of the ads there: soluble Pacific guano, put it on everything, right? Dixie Guano Company, high-grade fertilizers, engineers of cotton. And all of the agricultural publications, and I have read many of these, devoted tens, thousands of pages to discussion of guano, different types of guano, where to get guano, expensive guano, less expensive guano, the whole topic. And by the way, mentioning guano, I'll also note that plain dirt farmers couldn't afford it. So they sort of made their own equivalent by rotting leaves, soaking rotted leaves in urine, and basically taking any organic material they could find and pretending it was guano, but it wasn't quite the same. One of the factors that drove the cotton industry was fashion. And here you can see a portrait of Marie Antoinette right under the word King Cotton. And she is wearing essentially a country gown that became known as the robe de gaulle. And these little country gowns were made of pure cotton. And this became a fashion, an early 19th century fashion across Europe. Women wanted these cotton gowns. And that drove the European demand for cotton. But even in the US, if you look at that Godey's print there in the lower right, that was the American antebellum fashion. And just think how much cotton or how much fabric of any sort would have been required by one of those dresses. It could be upwards of 15 yards of fabric to make those full skirts. And so this also really drove the cotton market. And you can see the landscapes there, the factories, the processing plants, the ginning buildings, and enslaved people in the field, including children. And so this became really the enterprise that was driving most plantations in the American South. Eli Whitney patented the first really effective cotton gin in 1793. He was working in the South as a tutor. He got the idea of a machine that had teeth that would tease the fibers away from the seed. And then there was a screen-like grid that allowed the seeds to fall through. You can see his patent there in the middle of the page. Sort of a prototype, a table map model in the lower left, but then there were much larger versions of this made. Of course, patent law in the 19th century was not what patent law is today. And what happened to Eli Whitney was that he and his partner were demanding 40% of the proceeds of each crop just for ginning it. And this annoyed growers. And so growers would go into the buildings, the sheds where the gins were, and they'd look at them very carefully. And they would leave and they would build their own. And then there were many, many more inventors that used his same basic process of the teeth and the screening and just added a little something, tweaked it in some moderate way. And so he invented it, but I would say did not really enjoy the full proceeds that he felt he was entitled to. Of course, having all of this cotton seed left over meant that there was an opportunity for a cotton seed, a cotton oil in particular industry as well. And so the seeds were actually taken and pressed. And what was left over from the pressed cotton seeds, and there were tons and tons of these seeds because this was being done on such a huge scale, what was left was something called the seed cake. And you can see a picture of that over on the right. It looks kind of rough, looks sort of dark green. It's the seed coats and any proteins, and it's actually quite nutritious. And it was used as a feed for livestock. And then the oil was used in the ways that many non-drying oils are used to illuminate, basically to burn in oil lamps, for making soap, for lubricating machinery and equipment, and even after the tanning of leather. And so some growers were not only realizing income from the fibers, but also from the byproduct, which ordinarily they might have just simply discarded. Of course, in the years leading up to the Civil War, there was a strong abolitionist movement, particularly in New England, to some extent in the mid-Atlantic states as well. And the abolitionists strongly advocated seeking alternates to some of these slave cultivated crops. They wanted to see people avoid the use of cotton and instead use flax. Flax is also known as linen, or it's used to make the cloth known as linen. It's Linum usitatissimum, which in Latin means the most highly useful linen. It's an ancient European crop. It's a long fiber. It actually comes from the stems of the plant. It's sort of a difficult, smelly process to get those fibers out. But in many ways, linen is superior to cotton because it's stronger, it lasts longer. And then abolitionists in the Northeast advocated getting sugar from sugar maple. And you can see in the lower right there, a Currier and Ives illustration from New York City of maple sugar works. And then the artist Eastman Johnson in the upper right did an entire series of paintings, really beautiful paintings of sugar maple, boiling the liquid and actually producing the maple syrup and crystallizing the crystals from it in New England states. And so this was all part of the message of avoiding slave-produced goods and following teachings of New England abolitionists. So now we'll segue into plantation life and take a look at how people actually were living very close to the earth on American plantations in the southern states, the Confederate States. So the first enslaved people who arrived in America, in the southern colonies, actually built their own homes. And you can see one of those that's been replicated in the upper left. That's actually it's an African style hut. The walls were made of mud daub and the roof was thatched. And by the antebellum years, those had been replaced. And it was a combination of factors. I think some growers did not, and planters, the planter class, did not want to have what they considered primitive thatched roof, dirt floored buildings on their property. And so they started moving in the direction of log homes. But then abolitionists thought that slaves should live in greater dignity, and they were right. And they began advocating for timber framed homes. And you can see one of those in the middle, and there's really nothing more than about the size of a large room, maybe 12 by 15 feet, a couple of windows. But they did have floors rather than dirt. They had indoor fireplaces rather than outdoor fireplaces. Many slave owners strongly encouraged family life because they wanted people to reproduce and make more slaves. The wood of choice for making the better sort of slave accommodations was the bald cypress. That's a swamp tree. You can see that in the upper right there. The leaves, the needles on it look very much like the dawn redwood, to which it is related. And by the way, bald cypress during the Civil War was probably the most prized wood for building coffins as well. And it has the ability to resist fungal rot, fungal decay, and that's why it was good for both building coffins and building cabins. Lower right there, you see a little comic that I put in there. That's actually a Currier and Ives. I know it doesn't look like your typical Currier and Ives, but Currier and Ives in addition to publishing very refined images of American life, simultaneously were publishing a set of, I can only describe them as racist and crude illustrations known as the Darktown Funnies, the Darktown Comics, or the Darktown Funnies. And that's one showing enslaved people doing a haphazard job of fighting a serious fire in one of their cabins. But you can see the housing here really was made entirely from plant material. Another interesting sort of building or structure that enslaved people built were known as brush arbors or hush harbors. And the terms were used interchangeably. So brush arbors were a place where people could have some privacy and meet, particularly in the evenings, in the dark, to have church services, religious observations, to talk in African languages that they were supposed to be forgetting, to exchange information, I think much of it ethnobotanical information, medicinal uses of plants in a private environment away from the ears of overseers, planters. And so enslaved people would just basically in the evenings walk into the woods, or in the lower right there, that's actually a canebrake. So that's in the title of the talk, right? Canebrakes to cotton fields. Canebrakes were actually quite common still in the American South along rivers. And this is a Native American bamboo that makes a very, very dense planting natural habitat. And so some of the brush arbors or hush harbors were actually made by just sort of burrowing out a space in one of these canebrakes. The idea of making a brush arbor actually arose with colonists, American colonists, who used them for revival meetings. And they essentially were made from logs, and then the roofs were covered with branches. And then enslaved African Americans took basically the same idea, but their idea was to use the vegetation to deaden sound so that they could have a private service. And many of these services apparently were quite hybrid in nature. They combined maybe Christian hymn singing with African language, African traditions, and the transmission of information from African culture. How was all of this regarded in the popular culture? Well, we all know Stephen Foster. Stephen Foster actually was not a Southerner. And at the time that he wrote his songs, lionizing Southern culture, had actually never been to the South. But he wrote, for instance, My Old Kentucky Home in 1853, in which he described an idealized farm life in which the corn tops ripe and the meadows in the bloom, and the young folk roll all around the cabin floor. They're merry, all happy and bright. I don't think they were necessarily all happy, but that is what the song said. He also mentioned canebrakes. See that song in the upper right there, Down Among the Canebrakes. He wrote quite a bit about the cabins, how slaves lived. You get a little feel there for the dozens of these cabins in that image in the lower left, literally dozens of them in a row near the fields, ready for people to go and work. And so many Americans in the Northeast and elsewhere, in the years leading up to the war, thought of a very peaceful, contented, agrarian presence of enslavement in the South, because this is what was being portrayed in the popular literature and popular music, with a similar kind of message actually coming out from Currier and Ives. Some of it before the war, but some of it also actually, interestingly, after the war. So Currier and Ives were New York lithographers, and they produced these chromolithographs that suggested the peaceful coexistence of slave owners with the enslaved people whom they owned. This particular one was titled A Cotton Plantation on the Mississippi. And it was designed to show you how swimmingly well things were going after the Civil War. And this was published in 1884. And you can see that everybody's getting along really well. You have a black couple and their child in the road, and you have a white couple in the road, and freedmen, freed slaves, are working in the fields. But look way in the background there. Look at the destroyed trees that now just have bare branches. These are trees that were burned. So the landscape is still scarred. We'll talk more about the scarred landscape at the end of the talk. But this was actually commissioned by the federal government, I think, to show in the post-war years that things were going extremely well in the South. Actually, they were not at all, but this was the information that was being put out there. And then here's another one. Look at the lower right. That is a home in the Mississippi. This was published by Currier and Ives in 1871. Beautiful riverfront home in Mississippi. Again, probably a cotton plantation, showing that everything is going nicely. Those are mixed races in the carts with the horses and walking along the roadsides. But now we're going to segue a little bit into landscapes and landscapes on plantations. So I want you to focus on the trees in that Currier and Ives illustration there. And notice how the house is really constructed in a grove of trees, or perhaps the trees were planted in groves around the house. And many of these trees that were planted leading up to plantation houses or around a plantation house were southern live oaks. And you can see what a road of southern live oaks looks like in the upper left. These do not have the typical oak leaf shape, but they are nevertheless in the same genus, Quercus virginiana. And they were great shade trees. They performed an important ecological job because they actually can uptake, each tree can uptake hundreds of gallons of water each day. And so kept soil from getting muddy, kept roads dry, kept areas passable during periods of high rain. So roadways, avenues of trees leading up to plantation houses, and groves of trees did the same thing. And notice in the Currier and Ives illustration, you've got some kind of stringy stuff hanging off the oak tree there. In the upper right, you can see what that is. It's Spanish moss. It's a member, actually, of the pineapple family. It's a bromeliad. It's not a parasite. It's just an epiphyte. It just lives on another plant. And it takes advantage of the moisture in the air, and that is how it grows. It's not actually rooted in the ground. But Spanish moss ended up having a number of interesting uses during the war years, one of which was that the Confederate Army investigated the feasibility of actually weaving blankets from the leaves of Spanish moss. I don't think they would have been great blankets, but when fibers are short and you can't get your hands on wool and nobody's growing cotton anymore, I guess you use what you have at hand. Some of the other trees that were grown on plantation land. So certainly the most iconic of all of the southern trees are the magnolias. And this is what most people think of when you think of the South. You think of magnolia trees. And you can see what some of these are here. In the upper left, that's the southern magnolia. And that is really the archetype there. And to the right is the banana tree, banana magnolia. It's actually had a few different names. It's actually now in the magnolia genus, and it does indeed smell like bananas. And women would actually cut those flowers and bring them with them to dances so that they would have that banana scent. Below the yellow one there, the banana tree, is the lily-flowered magnolia. Over on the extreme left, under the southern magnolia, is that maroon one. That's the Ulan magnolia. And then the hybrid is in the middle, and that's the saucer magnolia. So it's Magnolia X Soulangeana, and the X shows you that it's a hybrid. And this is the one that is very popular today, at least where I live. A lot of people have these in their gardens today. But then it was the magnolias that really defined the American South and the popularization of these plants as archetypal southern vegetation. But there were many other archetypal southern plants as well that were actually not native to the US. And this shows you what some of them are. And you can actually tell from their Latin names what at least 4 out of the 5 had as their origin. So upper left there, that's a camellia. And look, it's japonica from Japan. Over on the upper right, crepe myrtle, indica, that's from India. Below it, Japanese pittosporum. In the middle there, with those sort of spotted looking leaves, that's the aucuba. Some people call it the japonica bush, but it's from Japan, japonica. And then in the lower left, orange trees from China. And these were all grown widely on plantations. They were grown in groves, they were grown in gardens, and they were prized plants. And Southerners very much wanted to have a beautiful landscape. And why exactly is this? Well, the planter class in the American South who owned slaves considered themselves aligned with British aristocracy. And they very much followed British trends when it came to home decor and horticulture, gardening for pleasure. And so there was an American horticulturist, Andrew Jackson Downing, who wrote the treatise on the theory and practice of landscape gardening. It was published in this country in 1841, and he advocated basically trying to make a landscape type of garden, a natural landscape garden in America. Americans that had sufficient land advocated that for them. And some Southerners did this. But of course, the problem was that they tended to want plants that would grow very fast. And some of what they planted turned out to be absolute botanical disasters and resulted in some of the worst invasive plants that we have growing in the US today. And here's probably the top 5, starting in the upper left there. Mimosa. Mimosa is a pest as far north as New York State. It's a legume, member of the pea or bean family, and as such, it has bacteria that live in the roots that can actually take nitrogen from the air and turn it into ammonia compounds. So mimosa can grow on terrible soil, and it will grow in waste places, and it's a problem. Upper right, the Chinese parasol tree. Again, it was a nice shade tree. It had these big broad leaves, but it produced altogether too many seeds. It was extremely aggressive, and most of the seeds tended to germinate. And so this was a problem because there just simply too many of them were around. Right below the parasol tree, which is in the upper right, is a lavender colored flowering tree there. That's Royal Paulownia. Royal Paulownia is from Asia and sometimes known as the Empress tree. Apparently in Japan, it was highly prized and the wood was used, and I think the wood is even used today. It has a unique way of photosynthesizing that allows it to basically shut down its leaf openings in the daytime and open them up at night. And so it can gulp in as much carbon dioxide as it wants when the temperatures are cooler. And so it's very efficient at photosynthesizing. But again, produces way too many seeds. And the seeds actually have sort of a downy, soft hair on them. And they were used for packaging Asian imported china and porcelain. And so stores and importers would take those seeds and just shake them outside, which meant even more of these Paulownia trees got started from the packing material. In the middle of the second row there, that's Chinaberry. There were a lot of these planted on American plantations. They're mentioned by Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin. She describes Simon Legree's plantation, a noble avenue of China trees whose graceful forms and ever-springing foliage seem to be the only things that neglect could not daunt or alter. But I tell you what, growers soon realize that these are the messiest trees known to man. They are continually dropping leaves, dead flowers, and those little yellow berries. And the one thing that's useful is the berry. If you press it, the seed inside does have an oil. And during the Civil War, people who had no other source of oil for making soap were making their household soaps out of the chinaberry seeds. And then the worst of all of these plants in the lower left, which has become invasive in the Northeast as well, is tree of heaven. Tree of heaven can grow up to 6 feet a year. It is, I suppose at first glance, attractive. It has pale green flowers. It has the compound foliage. It is a good shade plant. The plants were installed in Philadelphia gardens in the 1780s, and it was a bit of a fad. But the problem is, it has a very bad smell. You get too many of them together in hot weather, and you really can smell the oils from the plant. And it multiplies, it clones itself from root suckers. So the roots grow and then just simply shoot up little saplings here and there that are just clones of the parent plant. And so this is a problem. And this remains a significant issue, really, in the entire northeastern and southeastern part of the US right now. I want to say a little bit about garden design that wasn't the informal natural grove or avenue of trees that we often think of. So many in the planters class, particularly their wives, wanted to emulate the formal gardening style in Europe. And at the time, in Europe, this had almost become passé. This was more of an 18th century style, early 18th century style in Europe that had been supplanted by the landscape movement of natural gardens. But they wanted to go back to what they thought was the English aristocratic style of garden design. And these are geometric beds that were known as parterres. And people who had money who could do this sent off to England, Ireland, and Scotland and had itinerant gardeners come and work for them and install the system of hedges in these geometric patterns, and then install the bedding plants and the specimen trees in these parterres. So these are some designs. And this is how the hedging was actually done. The earliest ones were edged in the evergreen boxwood. And everyone has seen these. And this was the desired garden design for horticultural design at many plantation houses. Boxwood, however, grows very slowly. And one thing we know about a lot of these Southern gardeners who were, I think, really the nouveau riche, they wanted to be able to show off what they had quickly. And so they sought a plant that would grow more quickly into effective hedges. And so they turned to this Japanese spindle tree. So some of the later ones, right before the Civil War, were hedged in the Japanese spindle tree. And you can see how in these parterre beds, they would put in some specimen trees, sometimes rooted in the ground, sometimes in pots so they can be shifted around. But a lot of these flowering plants we've been talking about would be planted right in these parterres, basically as a specimen tree to be enjoyed for flowering. You can walk all around it and admire it through this system of hedges. And while we're talking about hedges, I want to say a little bit about fences and hedges of a more practical sort. So when you have a huge amount of land and it's defined as a plantation, people did want to have some sort of fencing around their land. So you can see in the upper left there, an elaborate plantation house and sort of a picket fence in the front. But just think of the maintenance that a fence like that would require. And then in the agricultural lands below it, split rail fences were used. And both type of fence suffered greatly during the Civil War. They rotted, they decomposed, they were used by Union troops and Confederate troops too as firewood. They were disassembled and used for making corduroy roads. Very few of those sorts of fences actually survived the Civil War. But some growers, some antebellum growers, realized that there might be a better way to define their agricultural lands and turned to growing natural hedges, thorny hedges. And the plant they used most commonly was Osage orange. And it It's actually in the mulberry family. And if you've ever seen one of these, it's about the size of a softball. The fruit is about the size of a softball. And it has a very strong aromatic scent, which is caused by a chemical 2,3,4,5 tetrahydroxystilbene, which also means that the plants are really quite insecticidal. So they are not attacked by insects. And the thorns, and you can see some of those thorns in the lower right, the thorns are thorny, they are dangerous. It's sort of the botanical equivalent of barbed wire, which, by the way, had not been invented yet. It's sort of presaged barbed wire. Osage orange was first discovered by Meriwether and Lewis in the central states. And they realized it could grow in the South after some experimentation. And the agricultural journals advertised cuttings and small shrubs that you could buy. And many growers did this, and they planted them. And they planted them along rail fences. And in the lower left there, you can see one that is now regenerating from an old Osage orange hedge that is regenerating. Now, why is there a mammoth in the middle of the page here? Well, the Osage orange actually has an interesting natural history, which I'll just mention briefly. The evolutionary botanist, Daniel Jansen, has been interested for several years in the size of the Osage orange fruit. And he's looked at the size of the fruit, and he has compared it to the width of the throat in existing mammals. There's nothing that is alive today that has a mouth and a throat large enough to gulp down the Osage orange, which is clearly something that evolved to be eaten whole, because it's very tough. It's almost impossible to pull one of them apart. And so now it is widely believed that Osage oranges evolved to be eaten by the extinct megafauna that died out at the end of the Pleistocene epoch about 13,000 years ago. So you can just think about a big woolly mammoth or a mastodon lunching on Osage orange. It used to have a much wider range, natural range, than it has today. They probably were originally native to the South as well. And then they were adapted to use as fences. Natural fences, hedges, were quite effective. And in a couple of cases, actually got involved in battles during the Civil War, where Union troops were able to hide behind a hedge of Osage orange and defend it and save themselves from attack by Confederate forces. And now let's take a little peek inside of plantation houses while we're here. So, we see the outside, it looks nice, the groves and so forth, but we go inside and we discover an elaborate interior. And this was the goal that most in the planter class had, to have this sort of a Rococo revival style interior. This type of furniture that you see here, the etagere on the right and the parlor furniture and the matching tables, the single best and most desirable source for this sort of furniture was John Henry Belter and his company that was located in New York City. John Henry Belter was a German immigrant who set up a cabinet making business in New York. And his parlor furniture was particularly desirable. And during the antebellum years, large quantities were shipped to Confederate states. And so you see a little bit more of the detail here of the Belter designs. And if you have a Victorian museum near you, they may have some Belter furniture there. And Belter furniture sometimes goes up for auction. Here in New England, where I live, the single best place to go and see Belter furniture is a museum in Portland, Maine, called the Victoria House, which was owned by a man who, in fact, had a sugar plantation in Louisiana, and he ordered plenty of Belter furniture. What did Belter do to make this furniture? Well, the actual carvings were rendered in basically plywood. The outer layers of the plywood were rosewood. And then there were 5 interior layers. So you had the rosewood veneers and then 5 interior thin sheets of wood that were glued together. And it was either hickory or black walnut or oak. And Belter patented this method. And it allowed him to curve the backs of chairs with steam and not have cracking, and also allowed for very, very deep carving. And the carving is almost entirely based on botanical patterns. And so if you look, you can see roses and morning glories and grapes and pomegranates. Those were considered a sign of fertility, by the way. Oak leaves, acorns, and he apparently based all of this carving on British pattern books that were available. You can see one of his patents at the top there. So that's what the interiors of these plantation houses looked like. During the war years, though, things really got tough, and there were shortages of almost everything, including illuminating oils. And so the oil lamps they had could not be used in many cases, and people began trying to light their houses, illuminate their houses with whatever was available. Some people burned pine sap, some people burned tallow, some people burned beeswax or various combinations of these. They would basically have a little bowl of some combination of these flammable substances and have a wick. And of course, it generated a huge amount of soot. So these elaborate interiors really suffered and became quite tainted with soot in many cases during the war years. One of the most popular emergency types of illumination was knots, because pine wood has knots in it, of pitch pine. And you can see one of those knots in the upper left. That's basically a branch that started, that broke off, and then it becomes embedded as the tree grows out horizontally through activity of the cambium. But in that knot, there is a lot of concentrated resin. And pitch pine in particular has a resin that when you burn it emits an extremely bright light. And so this took the place of illuminating oils and oil lamps, but made a mess. But this is how people survived the war. A little bit more on the interiors. I would just mention that houseplants were particularly popular in the antebellum years and during the Civil War. People, especially in the South, obtained books on houseplants and grew many houseplants, and particularly favored plants that could be hybridized to make various forms. So the upper left there, that was a Victorian favorite. That's the pocketbook plant, Calceolaria. They're from Chile with several species. And this particular one looks like a little section of a mandarin orange. There were dozens of these, and you could buy seeds and grow them and take care of them. Below it, primroses. Over on the lower left, that's known as a parlor maple. It's actually in the mallow family, same family, ironically, as cotton. And upper right, fuchsia was named for Fuchs, the herbalist, Renaissance era herbalist. And I think during the Civil War, people saw taking care of houseplants as almost a metaphor for taking care of family and keeping family together and keeping up appearances. And so houseplants became very popular during the war years, especially in the South. And that included the British fad of growing ferns. So in England, this was known as pteridomania. And there were all sorts of books written about ferns, and it showed up in domestic artwork and greeting cards. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward designed a glass case, and you see one of those in the top right. Ward designed his so-called Wardian case to basically allow for the importing of ferns from abroad. Delicate ferns can be put in this little miniature greenhouse, but then commercial suppliers began making elaborate Wardian cases to use in homes, and people who could afford them had ferns in their houses. They had ferns outside. They had them in rockeries and rock gardens and grottos and in the house, even in very shady corners. And then there was another type of case that was invented that became very popular in the South as well. And that's the one on the bottom there in the middle. That's called the Waltonian case. And this was a glass case, again, a little miniature greenhouse with a zinc frame, but it had a little place in that zinc base to have some little flames. And this would heat up the case just enough that that you could grow tender plants even in an unheated plantation house during the winter months. And then there was some curious crafts that got started that have a botanical basis as well. Wartime volumes of Godey's Lady's Book had all sorts of instructions for making artificial flowers from household materials and crafting rustic home decor, and included also an advertisement for a book called The Phantom Bouquet. And that's what you see here are some illustrations from The Phantom Bouquet. And in the middle, those are actually illustrations that were adapted to be used with a viewer. And so you get sort of a three-dimensional idea of that glass covering and the plant inside it. So what is the Phantom Bouquet? Turns out that Edward Parrish, who was the president of Swarthmore College, published this little book in 1863. And he had experimented with taking living plant material, soaking it in water, and allowing bacterial composition to clear off all the soft tissue so that all you had left was just the vascular tissue, the skeleton of the leaf or the skeleton of the flower. And then taking those skeletonized parts and bleaching them in some sort of a chloride, basically a bleach solution, either chloride of lime or chloride of soda, and then mounting them three-dimensionally. So this was right at the height of the Civil War. And I am sure that this had something to do with the focus at this time on death, because a lot of men were dying more from disease than from injuries. Men were coming home maimed, and women and daughters and aunts and cousins and grandmothers were sitting at home trying to think of something to do. And this was a craft that basically memorialized a dead plant. And I think it was a metaphor for human life. So what happened to these environments during the war? The last couple of years of the Civil War were really tough on plantations. The Union Army staged raids known as chevauché raids, the old medieval French term for this type of raid that focuses specifically on the domestic environment. Because if you think about it, most war does not go after the household, but these did. And so Union troops would come in, they would destroy fields, they would burn fields, they would dismantle, maybe burn fences or take the fence wood away for other uses. They would attack the crops. So that was the end of the cash crops. That was the end of the revenue. And then they would go for the house itself and take the provisions and curiously destroy textiles, which were plant-based in most cases. So cotton, textiles, bed linens, anything like this, particularly beds, were destroyed. So that many plantation houses after one of these raids were really not, they were not inhabitable anymore. So that was the end of much of plantation life. And people did end up starving. And there were bread riots. We don't have time today to really talk about diet. But into the war, there were bread riots. Women simply could not get enough food to feed their families in the South. And things were enormously difficult. And by feed, I mean basically provide corn, because the backbone of the Southern diet devolved to corn. People were basically eating corn for 3 meals a day. And now we're going to segue onto medicinal botany. Oh, sorry, just did something wrong here. So going into the Civil War, today we think of medicine as presenting a very united front. And you're not going to go to one doctor and another doctor and hear vastly different messages. But actually going into the Civil War, there were quite different philosophies of medicine. There were heroic practitioners who believed in dramatic processes like purging and strong laxatives and bloodletting. And then as a reaction to that, you had Thompsonian practitioners who followed the teachings of Samuel Thompson, who was a New Hampshire farmer. He became an itinerant healer, and he advocated using a lot of Native American medicinal plants. And then what we call the eclectic practitioners, who did a little of everything and probably most closely resemble medical practice today. But this was a time when there was a lot of mineral medicine, a lot of calomel, so a lot of mercury poisoning was going on. It was a time when there was a lot of self-medication with patent and proprietary medicines, which in some cases evolved into high alcohol content bitters. There was no understanding of the germ theory of disease. The idea of miasma was invoked. Miasma is basically bad smells. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But miasma was blamed for diseases like malaria. Sterile practice was unknown. So medicine, I think the best we could say is that it was quite primitive going into the Civil War. So in the South, they of course had no source of, pharmaceutical drugs. And when their pharmaceutical drugs ran out as a result of the Union blockade of the Confederacy, they had to turn to whatever was growing in the South. So there was a medical doctor. He was a surgeon, he was a botanist, he was a pharmacist. He also incidentally was a slave owner, Francis Pear Porcher, who wrote Resources of Southern Fields and Forests. And it was a big, thick book, published in 1863. And he did not have time to experiment with every one of these plants himself, but he basically combed the available literature. So he looked at classical texts in botany, chemistry, and medicine, encyclopedias. He went through patent office reports. He looked at notes in dispensatories, medical and farm journals, gardening texts, newspapers, folk wisdom, and hearsay, just whatever he could find, some of it reliable, some of it questionable, and assembled this book. And basically you can go through it and get his ideas about possible plants to try to achieve particular cures when actual pharmaceutical drugs were not available during the war. Malaria was a huge problem during the war. I mentioned before, this was particularly true in areas where they were growing rice in the South because they had intentionally flooded the rice paddies. But anywhere where there was standing water, anywhere where there were rivers that didn't flow too strongly in the summertime, or ponds or pools, you had the likelihood that Anopheles mosquitoes were going to start to breed. And Anopheles mosquitoes are the vector for a single-celled little protozoan. It's called a plasmodium. You can see one there on the lower right. They live in the salivary glands of the mosquitoes, and the larvae of the mosquitoes grow in standing water, and then the adults hatch out, and off they go to infect people with malaria. Of course, at the time, the actual cause of malaria was not known. People realized it might have something to do with water, but they instead linked smells to swampy habitats. And when you get that sort of gaseous smell that we call swamp gas, it's actually the breakdown of cellulose in plant cell walls to release methane, that they thought of as being miasma. And miasma theory was basically that the air is bad, that somehow there's something in the air. It was nothing more than a little bit of methane, but they were convinced that this was the causative agent of malaria. And so many in the planter class simply got out of the South. They would go elsewhere in the US to get away, but the military could not. Many more men died from malaria and other diseases than died from wounds during the Civil War. The Union Army had Frederick Law Olmsted, and now this has developed a little bit of a mind of its own. I'm sorry. Frederick Law Olmsted was the head of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, and he toured any area where they were proposing to have men in camp or set up an army encampment. And he was very much concerned about miasma, and he wanted also to stay away from water. So he realized that there was a link between malaria and water. And of course, you can see that there was a certain amount of fundraising that was done for the Sanitary Commission. Look, the Great Western Sanitary Fair. You'd even get to meet sick and wounded soldiers in 1863. So a little bit more on malaria. Many people had noticed in the South that about half of all slaves, especially slaves that came from slaves that were coming from Western Africa, actually seemed to be able to coexist with malaria without getting the disease. And this is in fact true, that when you look at Western Africa, and you can see that little map there in the lower right, right along that coast, it's in deep purple on the map, that's where you find an alternate gene, version of a gene known as an allele, for a condition called sickle cell anemia, sickle cell disease. And this overlaps with one of the most highly concentrated areas of malaria transmission in Africa. So the sickle cell allele, if you have just one of them, allows you to live a totally normal life. If you have two of them, you have sickle cell disease. But if you have just one of them, you not only can live a normal life, but you're also immune to malaria. And maybe about 40%, maybe even a little higher, of the slaves that were coming in as enslaved people on plantations had this mutation. So if you look there at the lower left, you can see normal blood cells and sort of the apricot colored there. They're basically biconcave discs. And then you see a few that have developed this odd tapered shape. They're color-coded. This is a color-enhanced image here in purple. Those are the cells that have adopted the sickle cell shape. And this would happen if one of these little plasmodium creatures invaded the cell and started using up oxygen. That one cell would form this odd shape, and then boom, along would come a white blood cell and eat it up. And so basically there was an early alarm system here in people who had just the one gene for sickle cell. And if they were exposed to malaria, the cell that was holding the plasmodium would be destroyed. And so these slaves worked with impunity in the fields. They could harvest rice, they could flood paddies, and without fear of disease. The main medicinal drug for malaria at the time was quinine. In the South, there was no quinine available. By the middle of the war, there was a Union blockade, and it was simply not available. And so they ended up having to look for some alternatives, which I'll talk about in a bit. But Union troops got a daily draft of quinine, and they had to line up around the bucket. It was extremely bitter stuff. It comes from a tree called the fever bark tree. It's in the coffee family, and it has an alkaloid in it. That's the quinine. The tree itself is known as cinchona or fever bark. It was known, since the 1500s from Jesuit priests who were in South America were aware of it. And it was brought back to Spain and became a very important medicinal drug in Spain, especially with colonists going worldwide. And so this is what the Union Army did. They dosed men with quinine and basically forced them to drink these very bitter draughts. Now in the South, Porcher and others experimented with possible other quinine equivalents. And the two most likely candidates were dogwood and tulip poplar. So you see dogwood in the upper left, and then in the upper right, that's tulip poplar. That's actually in the magnolia family. It's now the state tree of Tennessee. And both of them actually do seem to have some anti-malarial properties. And of course, the doctors at the time, the practitioners at the time, whoever was there, nurses, housewives, figured, well, bark, right? Because with the fever bark, with quinine, they were using bark. So they would just simply take the bark off the dogwood and the bark off the tulip poplar and boil it in water, sort of get a maceration and strain it. And there was a very popular recipe for this involving dogwood and tulip poplar, and also for some reason black willow, which does have a little bit of a pleasant taste to it. Black willow has methyl salicylate, which is oil of wintergreen in it. And so I think that was probably in there for the flavor. That's the plant in the lower right. And this may, in fact, have prevented some cases of malaria among Confederate troops. But the single most effective plant in the South for preventing malaria was this little tree known as Georgia bark. And it's actually in the coffee family, just like the source of true quinine, fever bark, or cinchona. And look at the incredibly narrow range that it has. You see that little map there in the middle on the bottom. It's just that little tiny area, Georgia, going into Florida. But the newspapers were filled with advertisements saying, if you have the bark of this tree, we'll buy it from you. We'll buy the trees from you, because it became an important medicinal plant during the Civil War for Confederate troops. And another plant that became well known medicinally during the Civil War was boneset, not only for malaria, but also for dengue fever, which at the time was known as breakbone fever. Breakbone fever, dengue fever has in common with malaria that the vector is a mosquito, but it's actually a viral disease, not a protozoan disease. And the idea of using boneset came from the old medieval idea of the doctrine of signatures. So dengue fever or breakbone fever is so painful that a victim feels that his or her bones are being broken. And look at the leaves of boneset. You see how they're actually fused across the stem. So according to this doctrine of signatures, which originated in Asia, but then was embraced by medieval and Renaissance botanists, that if you have a fusion like this, or a color, or a liquid, or a latex, that it's going to give you some sort of an indication of what the plant was good for. So a plant that had a red juice might be good for treating ailments of the blood system. Something like walnuts were thought to be good for treating ailments of the brain, because they look a little bit like a brain, and something like boneset was interpreted as being good for making bones heal. And breakbone fever, you felt like your bones were actually breaking. You can see a map there how widespread dengue fever was in the American South at the time. And so this also was used for both malaria and dengue fever. But the single most important botanical medicine during the war, I think we'd have to say, would be from the opium poppy. So either crude opium, which could be dissolved in alcohol, or the extracted alkaloid morphine, also from the opium poppy. So going into the war, opium use was rampant. You could buy it as various over-the-counter soothing syrups. Mothers used these with teething children. The bottle to the right there, below the mother with the child, that's laudanum. That's basically, today I think we call it paregoric. And it's a tincture of opium, 10% opium in alcohol, extracts the opium. After the war, you could buy your own hypodermic syringe from Sears and Roebuck and inject yourself. The problem with opium during the war was that it was used not only for pain, but it was used for fevers, bronchitis, kidney ailments, tetanus, cholera, leg ulcers, pain associated with gonorrhea, and then of course for the pain associated with wounds. And a large number of Civil War soldiers became addicted to it. Where was all the opium coming from? Well, it's a good question. The poppies were cultivated by some families, actually cultivated poppies, which they turned over to military doctors. In some cases, poppies had naturalized around homesteads. Even if the homesteads had been burned down, you could still find poppies growing because they're almost weedy in their growth. There may have been some imported poppies that were available for the Union Army. Poppies were available. It's not that there were really such tremendous shortages. And then from the latex, that's where the opium actually came. And then the addiction that followed became known as the soldier's disease after the war. And there were all sorts of supposed cures and sanitarium environments where you could go and supposedly get off the obligatory use of opium. And there was a lot of self-medication. There were certain medications that were plant-based that were advertised specifically to soldiers, and many of them were almost exclusively alcohol. And so you see there the flytrap bitters, Sarracenia. Sarracenia is actually an insect-eating pitcher plant, and you can see one of them in the upper right. And it supposedly was medicinal. I don't think it really was, but the plant material in it was preserved in high proof alcohol. And so it was a way of self-medicating with alcohol. A lot of these so-called bitters, Hofstadter stomach bitters, Holloway's pills and ointment, a lot of these were marketed in the super tents directly to men. And they have botanical origins and probably dubious effectiveness. I want to say a little bit about bandages during the war. Civilians were tasked with producing bandages, and one of the big things that was done by women and children was taking household linens and trimming them and rolling them into bandages, which then could be distributed to medical tents, hospitals. And there were actually societies that were set up in both the North and the South that were known as lint societies. And they were tasked with making a product known as either Sharpie or patent lint. And you can see one category of this in the upper right. So that's simply a piece of cloth where somebody has taken a knife and scraped it and scraped it and scraped it and gotten off all of the loose fibers so that you basically just have the warp and the weft left. And then that was actually rolled into sort of a rolled bandage. And that was sometimes sold or distributed as Sharpie or patent lint. And then the other meaning of those terms, Sharpie and patent lint, are for the loose fibers themselves. So it's a little bit of a confusing terminology here. But the loose fibers themselves were taken and wrapped in muslin. And these were actually put on top of wounds to absorb. And you can see there, I put a little stanza from Walt Whitman, the wound dresser. I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough, wash off the matter in the blood. It's a little bit gruesome. The bloody stump. So a lot of the men who ended up with limbs being removed, and this was the war with the greatest number of amputations of any war the U.S. has been involved in, ended up having their wounds dressed with this Sharpie or patent lint. And in the middle there, you can see a group of women working hard to produce the Sharpie and the patent lint bandaging material. And while we're talking about amputations, Civil War ended up as really a proving ground for many different new designs of prosthetic limbs. Leading into the war, many people just simply had a wooden peg. However, between 1861 and 1873, there were 133 patents for new prosthetic limbs and devices for amputees, 3 times more than in the 15 years that predated the war. Because there were an awful lot of men who came back missing arms and legs. And these were by and large made from wood. You can see some designs there. And the wood that was considered particularly desirable was willow because it's lightweight. And some of the legs were made to be hollow. So the stump would actually fit in to the hollow opening, sort of receptacle, and then would be tied on with straps. Some of them also involve some linen strapping. Some of them involve rubber as well, which is also a botanical product. Some successful legs were made from black gum. Black gum tends to resist splitting, and so the process of walking on a prosthetic leg could sometimes cause the wood to split, and black gum was resistant to that. Basswood and walnut. Walnut is known for its shock resistance. There wasn't a lot of walnut available though, because a lot of it had been used for making guns. And then some of the legs, and particularly the arms, were covered with paper mache. They were painted with plant pigments so that the prosthetic limb was a little bit more natural looking than just carved wood. And I'm going to say one thing about slave medicine, because we could have done an entire talk on slave medicine, but we didn't have time today. So slaves had their own gardens outside of their cabins. And in those gardens, they were responsible for growing absolutely anything that they needed. And Sometimes they grew food plants. Sometimes food was provided for them. But of a medicinal nature, they had to grow whatever they needed, whatever they wanted to have. And in some cases, actually grew medicinal plants for the entire plantation, not just for their own use. But there was one little conundrum that many planters didn't understand, and that is why many enslaved women did not have more children than they did. Why were the birth rates not higher? Because they were providing them with privacy, they were providing them with these little homes, and they were hoping that the birth rates would be high so that there would be more children whom they could sell into enslavement. Well, it turns out that there was quite a bit of practical knowledge that enslaved women had about birth control. And they knew the plants that they could consume, usually as some sort of a tea, because they didn't necessarily have access to alcohol to make a tincture. So imagine some sort of a tea. And these are plants that either prevent conception or damage a developing fetus. And three of the best known now, we realize, are asafoetida. That's the yellow flower over on the left. This was brought by enslaved people from Africa. Has a very strong smell. It's a close relative of an extinct plant called silphium that Greek and Roman women used to control family size in ancient times. And it contains a compound called ferragel, which is contraceptive. Tree cotton, same genus as the cotton that was being grown in the fields. How ironic is that? Contains a compound called gossypol, which actually causes damage to a developing fetus. So an early abortion. And then a plant called black haw. And we know less about black haw chemically. That one needs a little bit more investigation. But these were the three plants that enslaved women were dosing themselves with, explaining why many of them had, maybe 5 children rather than a dozen children or more, much to the annoyance of many of the owners. And now we're going to segue into my last little mini topic here, and that's military engineering. And there's a complex terminology here, and we're not going to go into it. If you're curious, you can get my book and you can read all the different terms. But basically, military engineering involved just about 100% plant materials. And you can see here some corduroy roads and various earthworks that are going on to stabilize the ground and make them suitable for building fortifications. But first, something that is a rare topic indeed, that many people don't know about, and that is the use of military balloons during the Civil War. Both the North and the South had military balloons that were used not for traveling, but for spying, for basically tethering onto the ground, letting them up into the air, and having an observation crew be able to peer out over the basket and see what the opposing forces are doing and planning. The balloon itself was made of silk, and silk is not a plant product, but it depends upon the silkworm, and the silkworm depends upon mulberry leaves. So I kind of consider this related to plants, so I scooped it up for the story here. Silk was in very high demand during the Civil War. It was used for the sashes, it was used for the medals, it was used for dresses. So silk was a high demand product, and it was also used to make the balloons themselves. And then that silk was covered with a varnish-like substance that hardened and preserved the silk. If you read, some Southern authors say that the Southern women actually took their dresses out of their wardrobes and gave their dresses to the military. And so you would have balloons with flowers on them and balloons that were plaid. I actually don't think that's true. I think there was some dress silk that was used rather than making dresses out of it. It was actually turned into balloons, but I don't think that women actually gave up their dresses. It would hardly have been worth it because the dress just did not have enough fabric in it to make an effective balloon. And a little bit more on the actual construction of military engineering, focusing here first on pontoon bridges. So to get across any kind of a waterway, you needed some kind of a bridge. And these pontoon bridges were built using 3 techniques, either wooden boats that floated under the bridge, or rubberized balloons that floated under the bridge, or some sort of a rectangular wooden framework that floated under the bridge. But the idea was it was a wooden bridge that then could float across water. These were portable. Armies brought them with them. You can see in the middle there, the bottom level, they have complex terminology. We're not going to go into all that though. And there were instructions for how you assembled it. The one thing that was wrong with the pontoon bridge was that if you sent men over it and they marched in lockstep, pounding, pounding, pounding in a march type beat, they could actually cause the bridge to sink. And so when troops had to go across a pontoon bridge, they told them just walk informally at different rates and distribute the motion so that we don't have the bridge sink into the water. There were a lot of corduroy roads. These were made out of any available wood. Most of them rotted in place after the war, but you can see in the lower right there, every now and then, one is still found today in a road area that was a dirt road that had a corduroy layer put on it, very likely during the Civil War. And these were made by simply cutting any available wood, laying it first, following the long direction of the road, and then laying a series of shorter logs perpendicular to the long angle along the road. And sometimes it actually took several layers of long and short seriatim to make enough of a corduroy road that the thing did not sink into the mud. And this was the main defense against really deep mud or even quicksand in some very wet, swampy areas. A lot of the big southern magnolias, the Magnolia grandiflora, the archetypal southern magnolia, ended up being incorporated into corduroy roads. And then the actual subunits of fortifications. And again, there's a complex terminology here of gabions and fascines and fascicles and saprolas, which I'm not going to go into. But basically, this was basketry, making baskets on a large scale. And the idea was you would have poles, and you would weave either grapevines or brushwood around the poles. And then in some cases, these were filled with rocks. Or if you look at the lower level there, second from the right, they would put two baskets, a larger one, a smaller one, and then they would stuff fascicles, bundles of twigs between them. This actually made a bulletproof defense. And so if you piled enough of these up, and the military manuals described exactly how to do this. This was not random work. These were all in particular sizes and dimensions and circumference, height, depth, width, all of this. And then if you piled them up and you did it very precisely, this made a fortification that would not fall down. And did eventually actually change the lay of the land. In some cases, as these actually decayed, there's now more soil. And so some Civil War battlefields where these fortifications were built actually ended up with a slightly different curvature to the land as a result of this military engineering. So, last couple of slides, this is what the South looked like after the war. A lot of the trees were badly damaged by musket fire. The same musket balls, known as mini balls, M-I-N-I-E, that caused so many amputations, that shattered bones, resulting in amputation of limbs, also ended up embedded in trees. You can see there on the lower right, one of these mini balls embedded in wood, and the wood is actually made of wound tissue around it, callus tissue around it. And this was the landscape. And did this come back? The answer is yes. Yes, the South did revegetate. But in many cases, it was a very slow process. And it seems that the mini balls did play a role in slowing vegetation down. And even today, the same sort of thing is happening, because as mini balls erode in the soil, they contain quite a bit of lead. And lead seems to slow the growth of soil microorganisms and may also interfere with the uptake of magnesium, which is needed to make chlorophyll. And so some areas have not revegetated as quickly as one might expect. And so this is a botanical environmental event that has basically occurred across the American South. You can see the battle map in the upper right there. And you just think of all those areas with the remnants of southern forests and the slow growth that it has been to revegetate and recolonize those areas. So that is my last slide. Let's see what else we have here. Plants in the Civil War. And it's somewhat of a companion volume to a book I published 3 years ago, A Botanical History of World War II. And both were published by McFarland Books. Plants in the Civil War came out just a few weeks ago. And they've both been extremely interesting to write. As far as I know, they are the only botanical histories of war. If you want to know a little bit more about other things I've written, my other books, judithsumner.com, and find me on Facebook. I don't put too much on Facebook, but I will, if I find an interesting article, like today I put up a couple of things on Christmas botany. Some of it's lighthearted, some of it's more research or a little bit more serious. But that's it. And I'm delighted to have had a chance to talk to you tonight.
We have a couple of questions that came in pretty early.
Great.
Don't go away. Most of them have to do with cotton. Cotton. We had one question about naturally colored cotton. I'm not sure if it refers to in those days. Did they? I mean, we all know that dyes were used. So it said, do you have any information on naturally colored cotton?
Naturally colored cotton. When the cotton fibers were just slightly off-white, and when woven became sort of the color of muslin. And I think there were various techniques that people used for trying to bleach the cotton if you wanted a pure white for bedding. I know one of them involved in areas where there was snow, actually spreading the cotton out in snow, that spreading the sort of off-white muslin, for instance, for sheeting in the snow, and then hoping more snow would fall on top. And children were tasked with the responsibility of keeping it covered, because if there were Native Americans in the area, they would sometimes come and see, oh, cotton, great, and bundle it up and take it home with them. But cotton from the fibers, even though the fibers look quite white when it's woven, is not pure white. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Well, and there's another related question about wanting to know about what is different about cotton than years gone by. She had a question about, if you bleach it, it turns yellow. But I don't know if that's in your area of expertise.
I can't take you up to date on 20th and 21st century cotton, but I can tell you a couple of things. First of all, cotton is quite a genetically variable plant. And during the Civil War, there were actually a couple of varieties that were grown. There was Gossypium barbadense, and then there was an upland variety as well. And they differ in the textures of their fibers. The upland variety had longer fibers that were very soft, and they were considered more high quality. That was the Sea Island types of cotton that were grown off the coast of Georgia. The cruder type was the one that was more widely grown. And there were many, many different varieties. And the agricultural journals that I read, and I read a lot of them, all had different advertisements for cotton. And sometimes a grower would basically steal seed stock from the guy next door, and there'd be an argument about it. But there was continual selection for cotton. Now, cotton today, I think, is genetically modified. And I think some of these colors, that if you bleach cotton today, I have noticed this, it will turn yellow. I think this has something to do with how the cotton is being chemically treated before we get it in our hands. I don't think it has to do with the actual nature of the fiber. I think it has to do with some industrial process that those fibers experienced before it ever hit your laundry room. And that's my knowledge of modern cotton in about a thimble.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Now we have several thank yous and fascinating. So many things I never thought about before. A comment about reading your books, and if you weren't in here earlier, Chris, we are purchasing the Canebrakes or the book that she was talking about tonight. It's on its way. It hasn't been delivered yet.
Here it
So
is.
yeah, there it is. Plants of the Civil War. So we will have it in our hot little hands soon. Another comment, it's nice to hear you pronounce orange. I'm from Boston.
Did I say it in a Boston way? How do you say it? Orange? Orange?
Orange?
Yeah.
Aren't you
Orange.
glad I didn't say banana?
Everybody in the Midwest says orange.
Yeah.
Orange.
Orange.
Oh, orange.
It's orange, right?
Orange. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we just had one more comment. There is naturally colored cotton in the tones of red, green, and brown. The sea islands had pinks and yellows.
I have heard that. I have never seen it. I would love to see that.
I have seen brown cotton, at like seed swaps and stuff where people actually brought it to swap the seeds. So, and it's, pretty dark brown, dark tan brown. And so I guess if you didn't bleach it or treat it in any way, that's how it would look.
Though, I think that by the 19th century, people liked such bright colors, and aniline dyes had been invented, and there was a big tilting in taste toward very, very bright colors and magentas and purples. I don't think people would have been content with a dusky rose that was natural. I think they wanted the real color.
And probably
In
white
fact,
cotton was the best to use as a base, right?
Well, yes, I think that's right. And I think those aniline dyes were so dramatic, and that's what the Victorian mindset really wanted at that point. And they were stable, and you didn't have to re-dye things every year the way they were doing in colonial. In colonial America, the women would take out the lining of their bonnet and re-dye it every year and then stitch it
Wow.
back. Like,
Oh.
work.
That's
But
pretty amazing.
that's the way it was done. But
Okay,
by the beginning of the 20th century, people who thought they were a little bit better than everybody else actually began to shun some of those purple and magenta colors.
Mm.
Eudora Welty's mother refused to drive down certain streets in Jackson, Mississippi, because those streets had a lot of magenta colored flots on them, and it so offended her.
Oh, well. Well, on that note, we have a few more thank yous, and we really do appreciate all your knowledge. And I really want to have you back at some point for your World War II talk. I'm sure we'd love to hear that as well. So maybe next year we can do that as a 2023. Okay, well, thank you for coming. Thank you so much, Judith. You have a great holiday season and New Year.
You too. Thank you, everybody. You've been a lovely audience.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.